Dr. Nerenberg's mind-body workout system.
Welcome, 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 my dear brothers and sisters, my beloved wife, Maheen. Honored guests, distinguished guests, those in the room, those watching on DVD, those listening on CD. I'm very grateful you're here. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be with you. I'm honored to have the opportunity to present this information. The title of today's lecture is Workplace Harassment, Violence, and Psychological Disability, the Need for Justice. The good news is a very compassionate system. There was a time where if you couldn't work because you were disabled, you lost an arm or a leg, or you were extremely depressed, no one cared. Either you worked or you starved. If you're fortunate, you had society to help you, or back long enough, the tribe looked after you. But there's a history of people becoming disabled at work and not having an income, and therefore not being able to work, having gainful employment, not being able to support their families, becoming homeless and starving. The good news is we now have insurance policies to cover that. In the state of California, for example, we have a state disability. People actually pay into that. It's not a lot. It comes to maybe $50 a year. That's what it used to be. Or if a person has a more permanent disability, they can apply for SSI. Or the person may have a private disability policy they've been paying for through a health insurance. And thus, if they become disabled, and in this case, we're talking about stress-related disabilities, psychological disabilities. What kind of psychological disabilities are there that can interfere with a person's performing their job duties? Major depression is one. There's actually an impairment of concentration and memory. Often the person sleeps a lot or can't sleep. They're tired. They're not enjoying their lives. But particularly the concentration issue will interfere with the job function. They're not able to retain information. They're just preoccupied. They might have an anxiety disorder, a generalized anxiety disorder. Or there might have been a threat on their lives at the workplace and suffer from a post-traumatic stress disorder, in which case there's an actual aversion to being in the environment. It brings back flashbacks to the threatening event. The main cause that I see in my office of workplace disabilities has to do with harassment from management. Now, to a lesser extent, we see harassment from coworkers, but we see the bulk of what we see comes from harassment of management, and I'm going to be primarily addressing that today. You also have disabilities that are not related to work and the people's personal lives. They're just prone to depression. It could be a biological imbalance. It could be a marital issue, a divorce. That'll trigger off a major depression. That'll trigger off a severe anxiety reaction. So it could be from their personal life. Very often it's a combination. The person already has some stressors in their lives. They feel picked on by the supervisor. They're harassed just because of who they are, because of their gender, race, religion, national background. They'll just add to it. And sometimes not based on any of those facts, just their personality. It's just a conflict that happens. All disabilities that take place at work, psychological disabilities at work, if it's related to management, and you're dealing with a reasonably normal employee, typically, so I can't say all, but typically there's an abuse of power. When I went to a seminar at the National Institute of Health and I was presenting on road rage, but then a part came up about workplace violence, the focus was on what factors predispose a worker to becoming violent in the workplace. And so they want to be able to screen people out who could become violent. I took the position that a great deal of the violence in the workplace is related to abuse of power from management. If management is fair, somebody may not like the decision, but they'll say, well, I don't like it, but it's fair. But if a person feels picked on, every time I do this, I'm a minute late, I get written up, but these other people do it and they don't get written up, that's not fair. Just as an example. Now you have cases where a person feels very alone with the harassment that takes place. You have cases of a supervisor or even a coworker sexually harassing someone. I've had cases where it's not only verbal, but they might actually touch the person. And the person will then report it. May not say anything for a while, but then report it. And it's made even worse then if the administration, the superiors, don't do anything about it. So people feel alone in the workplace. They feel abused, harassed, sexually or otherwise, and often feel powerless. What can they do? They go to the authorities, nothing happens. And it's really traumatic when they have a union, which is supposed to protect them, and they don't even feel the union does anything. Now, people have to understand their rights. When they understand their rights, they don't feel as powerless. You have the right to be on disability. There's also workplace disability, which is workers' compensation. All employers have workers' compensation. If you're injured on the job, it'll pay you while you're out. Typically, it pays higher than, say, state disability. Some cases, the workers' comp will pay 75% of the salary, whereas when they look at what they get from state disability, it could be 50% or less. But the fact that society has evolved to the point where we have such a thing as disability, whether it's due to work or personal life, is a great advancement in society and the advancement of civilization. Now, I've had cases where I'll go through different kinds of cases that I've had. One person felt so harassed by his supervisor, he was actually having fantasies of choking the person to death. And he didn't want to do it. He felt if he kept going in, he wouldn't care what he did, he was going to kill this person. And so he knew that, and he's the kind of person who really just wouldn't care, just was going to do it if the person picked on him one more time. So he went out on workers' compensation. You have cases where people are being followed as a driver, that maybe have somebody following the person. I've had cases where they're being followed, where the supervisor even following the person to the bathroom to see really where they're going, how long they're staying in the bathroom. Now, in some cases, these might be justified. The employee's not doing his work, and they need to just check what's going on. But often, it's uncalled for. And very often, you have a new supervisor, new management might be even more prone to this. They have to show they're really doing their job, so they may be more harsh and come down harder than, say, somebody who's more experienced. And it depends at what level they're at. Sometimes you have management, you have a supervisor, and then you got the employee, and the supervisor's in between. The management's saying, no, you've got to get on this person, they're not productive enough or whatever. And so they're coming to be really mean, what looks like mean and unfair to the person, but really it's coming from above. So they're caught in between. Sometimes they feel really badly about what they have to do to their employees. At the same time, they have pressure on them to be this way. I've had people who absolutely wouldn't tolerate that and said, I'm not going to do it, and left their jobs. That's pretty rare. And it's harder to do. It's much harder to do if you're married with children. This person was single. It's easier to do. Now, who's more vulnerable to harassment on the job? Well, somebody has a high school education, and they get a job with an employer where they're making $20, $25 an hour, $30 an hour. Well, that's great. I'm making all this money, and I only have a high school education. But I've seen with an employer, unless the employer has a conscience and a morality, their attitude can be this, and I've seen this. We know you can't make this kind of money anywhere else. We can do whatever we want to you, and what are you going to do? You know you can't make this money anywhere else. And particularly if they're married, supporting their children, they feel they've got them. So that which looked like a great thing, they got this job, it's great as long as there's justice in the system. But if there's an injustice because somebody has a grievance against you, they don't like you, for whatever reason, race, gender, nationality, or just who you are, where are you going to go? Now, if a person's really underpaid, they might say, I'm not going to put up with it. I'm on minimum wage. I'm gone. But I've seen people working places on minimum wage who didn't go anywhere else. They didn't speak the language very well. And the supervisor became very abusive. And she tolerated it because she had no option. She didn't speak the language. She felt very vulnerable being in this country. So, again, this is an injustice that takes place. Now, the good news is justice will prevail. When people understand their rights, it works slowly. Justice will prevail. And I often give that as a power thought, a thought to keep repeating throughout the day. Justice will prevail. Justice will prevail. It's a power thought, repeating it. And the good ways to do it, there are 23 factors that will internalize the thought more powerfully and amplify it. Dr. Nerenberg's mind-body workout system. One is a relaxer. So we'll close the eyes as an example of it. Take a deep breath. Justice will prevail. We could add and expand on it, always. Justice will prevail, always. Justice will prevail, always. We can use proprioceptive involvement, so I'm pressing my arms together, or you can be exercising. Justice will prevail, always. Justice will prevail, always. A person can then use also a solidifier. Justice will prevail, always. Focus on the words as they're saying it. You have the proprioceptive involvement, and I'm grateful. They're grateful that justice will prevail. Justice will prevail always, and I'm grateful. We could add an amplifier. Justice will prevail always, and I'm very grateful. Or even more, I'm extremely grateful. You can add a spiritualizer. Thank you, Lord. Justice will prevail always. I'm extremely grateful. Thank you, Lord. Justice will prevail always. I'm extremely grateful. Thank you, Lord. Find that it's good to do like twice an hour, 3 deep breaths. The deep breathing is itself very relaxing. Most people are under-oxygenated and dehydrated. Most of us need more water and more oxygen. Or the other formula is to do it every 5 minutes the first day and twice an hour thereafter. But that's a good one, and in the long run it will. If a person's been mistreated on the job, they're going for workers' compensation, disability, whatever, and it's a legitimate case, it's going to work in the long run. It really will. Even if you're initially turned down, there's a whole appeal process. A person needs to know they have these rights, and they're also concerned, well, will my job be there when I come back? Well, under the American Disabilities Act, they have to make reasonable accommodation to your disability. Now, they can only do that if they have enough employees. If it's a mom and pop operation with 2 employees and you're taking off because you're disabled, they can't function. They're going to have to replace you. But when they have over 50 employees, it comes under a set of laws. They have to make reasonable accommodation. And some places will hold the job open 3 months. There are others that will hold it for years, particularly if there's union involved. The union has a contract, they'll hold it open in many cases. Now, when a person feels they can't function anymore, we have to understand something. But when we look particularly at the case of harassment, people come home and think about it all day long. He said this to me, he's done that to me. I can't take this anymore. I just can't stand it. I hate getting up. They might love the work. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people like the job itself. But typically, the disabling mental condition, mental aspect, has to do with management, supervisors, and at times coworkers. And particularly then when someone reports it to the superiors, I've been harassed by this person, whether it's sexually. I had somebody make a threat against my patient to harm him and his wife and child in front of management. They didn't do anything. So then it feels, well, then it makes the upsetness, the anger, the preoccupation with it exacerbated tremendously. It didn't even do anything when this happened. The threat was made in front. Why didn't the supervisor do anything? Well, it could be favoritism. Or it could be sexual harassment, but it might be a male-dominated industry and the male management may not do anything. So then you have to begin litigation. Now, to the extent an employer is fair and just, what a savings there'll be in litigation, workers' compensation, lawsuits. I know of a case that I read about. She was a manager, actually. It was actually reversed. The employee poked her in the breast. He was upset, poked her. She got $300,000 for that aspect of the poke. This was a reverse. This was, which happens at times with employees actually harassing the supervisor. But it was a male-dominated industry, and it was retaliation from others against her in a hostile work environment. She was awarded by a jury $42 million. $300,000 for the sexual harassment, $42 million retaliation and hostile work environment. Now, the employer could have appealed it. Maybe it was reduced later on after I saw the case written up. Maybe it was reduced to 25 or 30 million settlement. Who knows when after it was appealed. But it was still substantial. Just to give an idea. Now, people have to understand you have attorneys, you have Congress people, you have your doctors. And to the extent you're documenting what's going on, particularly if you have witnesses and you want to go towards workers' compensation. Now, a lot of times a co-worker or a witness won't want to sign and say, I can't jeopardize my job. But often they will, but they won't write it up. You typically have to write it up yourself, say such and such a time on this date, I witnessed such and such supervisor yelling at Mr. Jones. So you write up and you ask the guy to sign it. There's a chance that he will. I have a case of a worker who worked with radioactive materials, and it wasn't being disposed of in a proper way, and he was concerned about the safety of the workers and the safety of the environment of what could be happening from this radioactive material. And he kept warning his superiors about this is dangerous. It's against regulations. It's dangerous. Well, they didn't do anything about it. So he eventually became what's called a whistleblower. He went to the authorities and said, this is going on. I can't be a party to it. He was a party to it for a number of years. His conscience just got to him. I can't do this anymore. Well, what they did was, and this is typically what happened, I call it the assassination of the plaintiff. Then in a lawsuit, what typically happens is the company that you filed a complaint against will typically end up making an accusation against you. I've seen cases where workers' comp claim was filed and the person was accused of stealing. In this case, they get a psychiatrist to examine him. This is one of them. They fired him. They ended up firing him. That's retaliation. They ended up firing him. I was an expert witness on the case. And then they get a psychiatrist to analyze the case, to analyze him. Well, let me tell you what I call assassination of the plaintiff. Because I know this is going to happen. See, when they tell me the psychiatrist is going to see him, I say, guess what? What? They're going to come up with a personality disorder. I mean, it's almost a violation of the healing principle. Personality disorder, they say, well, this person is really a paranoid personality disorder. They feel picked on. Or this person's a sociopathic personality disorder. You can't trust them. So once the person is diagnosed with a personality disorder, which is practically incurable, unlike depression or anxiety, you lack credibility. You're just paranoid. You think everybody's picking on you. And keep in mind, very often in this litigation, it's your word against a supervisor, your word against, that's why you need the witnesses, if it's going to go into a lawsuit. So that's typically what happens. So my job often is to look and see if that's a fair diagnosis, and typically it's not, and then say, no, they don't have this symptom, and so forth. One time the psychiatrist messed up the diagnosis so badly of the personality disorder that a key factor was that the disorder had to come about before age 15. And there was never any question, because I looked at the interview, there was never any mention of what age what the onset was. So it was really an unethical thing to even come up with that diagnosis of the particular personality disorder. So he never even looked at the onset, the age of onset. So I had to discredit that psychiatrist right off with that. So, and I did that before the jury and judge. So you have cases, we have assassination of the plaintiff, that's a lawsuit. Now that person wasn't disabled, he was wrongfully terminated. But again, it's another manifestation of the injustices that happen. Now, often and this is a tough one. A lot of times an employee will be in trouble with management because he's not really a yes man. And so many supervisors and management have a problem with that. Of course, it depends how it's said, if it's done disrespectfully or not. But typically in corporations, or it could be a government job, very often the interest is not wanting to have your ego affronted. Understandable, you don't really want that. But a lot of times this person, even if the person's objecting for good reason, either what's being done to him or to the co-workers or to the environment, many people have problems tolerating that, especially if it's done in front of others, of course. But even on one-to-one basis, it could be hard to take. Say, I don't like you did this, it's wrong. Even you take a person aside and probably this is wrong, we need to do this a different way, it's not right. That can really irritate somebody. Many organizations are known that the yes man will advance. Of course, this is unjust. I mean, if it's a yes, because everyone wants a supportive environment. That's natural. Supervisors, employees, everybody. But really, the governing principle has to be fairness. If a person says, I don't like this guy's criticisms, but he's right a lot of times, and be able to incorporate that. That's then a fair individual. I sure don't like what feedback you gave me, but you're right. A lot of times people aren't mature enough to sort that out. I've done a whole program on how to teach fairness training called Law of the Key Factor. I have a book and lectures on it. No management principle can actually work unless there's a foundation of fairness. No matter what management method is used, if it's not first predicated on people being fair, it's going to fail. Nobody can tolerate the injustices. Injustices produce disability. Injustices cause disability. People come home thinking about it all day. They become irritable with their spouse, with their kids. They wake up in the night with nightmares. They can't sleep, can't eat. It gets to that extent. It really does. And it could be somebody with pride. He's always worked, and now, but he can't even bring himself away from the job because he's the breadwinner and he's never collapsed or anything, but he's obsessed all the time with this. All the time thinking about, he said this, he did that. And the case can happen where he's on the guy's bad list. So no matter what he does, he's being picked on. That actually does happen. Sometimes a person may imagine it may not really be true, but often it does. No matter what, now you're on that bad list, you come under greatest scrutiny, whatever you do, it's wrong. You get written up. The other way it happens is somebody new comes in, takes a dislike, writes you up, and the person's been there 20 years, never had a write-up. Well, what's going on? That's then part of a defense. It has something to do with this person. So these are some of the aspects of the injustice, but the amount of harm caused by the injustice is enormous. I see it in my office. And people become afraid even to go back to work because they fear retaliation. They need to understand, again, they have their doctor, they have attorneys, but there's another part. Especially if it's a big employer, they say, what are you going to hire an attorney? Okay, go ahead and sue us. We violated the American Disability Act, go ahead and sue us. If you find an attorney who takes it on contingency, which means they get a percentage if you win, that's one story. But very often they want $5,000, $10,000 up front. They know you can't come against them. Now, capitalism is a great system, economic system. It produces inspiration, hard work, it does great things. But capitalism without conscience is dangerous. Let me give you an example. You have a major corporation, and the CEOs are all answerable to the board, to the stock holders. They have to show a good profit. And this guy's been working 30 years, and we're paying him $80,000 a year because he kept getting raises every year. Well, if the only thing that matters is the bottom line, not loyalty or fairness, I will harass this guy till he can't stand it. He'll quit, or we'll get basis for firing him. And guess what? We can replace him for half the amount. Instead of paying $100,000, we get somebody for $50,000 or $40,000. Why not? Our only obligation is the bottom line. Doesn't that make sense? Capitalism without conscience, isn't that what they should do? If there's no loyalty or morality or conscience, isn't that what they should do? Why pay this guy this money? He's been here 20 years. Who cares? All that matters is the bottom line. That's why you have to have conscience. You have to have fairness. Capitalism without fairness, without justice, is dangerous because that's what it has to lead to. Without a sense of social responsibility, we're dealing with a dangerous system to the well-being of the individual. 30 years of giving his life to that company terminated because they could replace him for a fraction of the cost. I've seen it in my practice over 35 years of practice. I've seen it all those 35 years. So certainly, to reduce these disabilities, reduce the lawsuits, the litigation, then justice needs to be introduced in. Now, the cure, again, is fairness. Certainly, there are people who will come in and say, it's racial. I'm this race, and I'm the only one picked on. I do a better job than the others, and the supervisor just picks on me. Well, if you can demonstrate that, you have rights. That's the good thing people need to know. They have rights. Also, if you're afraid of retaliation, you just document such and such time a person did this, they did that. And that woman I mentioned to you, getting $42 million, retaliation, hostile work environment, once you demonstrate it, is highly litigatable. So a person has to understand, we're not, part of what I try to do is empower my patient, realize you're not powerless. You have rights. You have rights to disability, you have rights to workers' comp. Now, workers' compensation is a little tricky. You might have been injured on the job, but I have many people who'd rather just go state disability and be paid that way rather than file a workers' comp claim, because workers' compensation, if it's stress-related one, not like an arm being cut off where it's cut and dry, workers' compensation might take 6 months to get a verdict. And the terrible thing is, the doctors from workers' comp, if they really advance everybody who's really damaged on the job, why hire this guy? Actually, an injustice comes in, and I would have to say the cases where really there be hired guns to turn the person down. I've seen so many rejections that were obviously done. It's almost like, if you're willing to keep at this long enough, then you must be a real case. And I've seen them turned down, and you can't help wondering, well, are they just paid to turn the person down? You don't know. And then you have to appeal it. So the person may not get, if they're lucky to get the money, it takes them 6 months to get money. But then if they have to appeal it and then get legal counsel, it could be 9 months, a year. How many people can make it? And the employers know they can't hold in there. Now, I had somebody, she owned apartment complexes. And so when she went on workers' comp, when she went on disability, she could handle it because she had money coming. She was pretty rare. She saved her money, invested. Most people can't hang in there. So they'll go with state disability, because state disability usually within 2 to 3 weeks, money's coming in. And it's too overwhelming to go. For me, even to write up a state disability, it takes me maybe, after I've done the examination, I determine it's truly a disability, it might take me 15 minutes to write it up. Workers' comp is a huge job. You've got to accumulate witness statements. You got to put together all the medical documentation. It's a big write. It's a big job. And then on top of which the person probably won't get paid. And on top of which the medical professional probably won't get paid either. Unless, if it's not approved, nobody gets paid. So who wants to even take it? Now, let's take a look at what happens. A person comes in, they say, I can't function anymore in the job. I've just had it. I've been picked on. I just can't do this job anymore. I always loved it. I wake up in the morning, I dread going in, come home drenched in sweat. I just can't do it anymore. So the first step is then I have to then write the employer, write a note due to his, and after I've done the examination and I determine that the person cannot return to work, that has precipitated a diagnosable medical condition such as major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, or it's exacerbated such a condition, and therefore the person can't function on that job any longer at this time, then I need to then notify the employer that this person now will be out for a period of time. It's arbitrary. How long is it going to really take this person to get over it? It's pretty hard to predict. Depends how resilient they are. It also depends probably on how fearful they are going back. They might have been so brutally brutalized at the job that it's going to take longer. I'll typically use 3 months. If the person recovers before that, I'll release them. If it takes longer and it's medically justifiable, I'll keep them out longer. So I'll say the letter, if I wrote a letter, it would be, due to the medical condition, Mr. Jones will be unable to attend work-related responsibilities prior to 2/15/2010, for example. 3 months from now. That's it. Now, sometimes I would get calls from the employer, but I won't talk to the person because I'd had experiences before when I did discuss things many years ago. They'll say, well, the doctor said you can go to work, and I never said that. My words could be distorted, so I won't talk when they call. I'll tell my secretary, if they want information, have them fax it to me, and I will respond in writing so there's no misunderstanding. I have to do that to protect my patient. I will not discuss it. And there have been some times when they have an evaluator to monitor whether this person is disabled or not, and they'll turn my person down. So you're no longer disabled. I just wrote that he is. So then I've done this. I've called the examiner with my patient sitting there, so there's no misunderstanding about what's been said or not said. I won't do it unless my patient's there. And then say, look, the person has a major depression, generalized anxiety disorder. It involves concentration impairment. They can't function. Well, how do you know they're not fabricating that or just making that up? See, some are pretty compassionate. The state disability, there's not that harassment. But then there are others that really take the attitude that it's all a fraud. The patient can work and doesn't want to work, something's unpleasant, or they're lazy, or whatever, and you become an accomplice. There's almost that attitude with some, not with all. So then I said, well, this one test that I give, the Penn State Worry Questionnaire, has 0.98 sensitivity. But let's face it, a person could say anything, right? A person could say, I can't function. They fabricate how they respond to the response. Can they fool me? It's not likely. Is it possible? Rare. We've hard to do it. But then I say to the person, look, the person was making $70,000 a year and now on disability is making $30,000. That's a pretty good testimony. This is pretty real. Then I've had the person say, yeah, but they may be happy with that $30,000. I say, guess what? He has a wife and kids. 4 kids. Okay, then there's more credibility to it. But again, I'm dealing with somebody who has the idea that this is all fraud or this is all not real. Again, I don't get that from the state disability. I've never, maybe over 35 years, one time had the state call me on a case. Now, the state, when a person goes to EDD, they go to the state disability, they will have a psychiatrist. Their psychiatrist interview the person. 95% of the time, they'll affirm that they're disabled. But let's face it, they're being paid, and some of them probably feel they've got to turn some down. I'm not wondering sometimes. But then there's an appeal process, and almost always win on the appeal. And I've had patients on occasion with state disability turn down after a 5-minute interview. So you're not disabled, but you return to work. And I've been seeing the person. I've spent hours, evaluating. But then when I write up on the appeal, we've always won. I think maybe one case I didn't, but it almost always won. Over 99% of the time I'll win on the appeal. But there, it's not, they're rather err in the direction of giving too much than cut people off. Others rather just cut them off rather than give them the benefit of the doubt. So I'm dealing with people who are suspicious it's all fake, the patient's fooling me. So but now you have some when you take a person out, we have a form. Some of them have forms. I want to go over some of the forms, what they ask. They might ask the date. Typically, they'll ask, what is the date they first saw you? And they want to know what's the treatment procedure. The treatment procedure for me is individual psychotherapy. That's pretty much what I do. And I'll refer them out. I'm a psychologist, so I'll refer them if I feel that out to get medication. Now, a lot of my patients don't want to be on medication. They're afraid of it. And rightfully so. The side effects are terrible. I mean, more and more data comes out where people even became suicidal on some of these antidepressants. I knew one person on antidepressant was on Prozac. This person said it was like somebody turned the lights on, went from depressed to feeling better. Somebody else on Prozac, when she even looked at a tree, began to cry on Prozac. Just to give you an example of a wide variety of reactions. So it doesn't mean because they're on a prescription that's going to help them. It might actually hurt them or make them sluggish. Then it's a matter of finding the right dosage, the right one. But then it's known that there's some natural substances that are known to help with depression. St. John's wort, fish oil in sufficient dosages, 5-HTP for anxiety. So there are some of these that patients will take when you let them know there are natural approaches they can use. I can't prescribe it. I say, these are things people consider. You might want to consider this and research it. And people often would rather go to something natural first. But now keep in mind, there is a monitoring system from an agency to see if the person continues to be disabled. There are forms and so forth. And if the person's not on medication, that works against them. Well, if they're not disabled, how come they're not on medication? Not really cooperating with treatment because they're not on medication. But they're afraid of the medication. Well, I've been writing fish oil. I don't know how that works with them. I say, they're on fish oil. If somebody gets diarrhea from it, that's a bad side effect. They often want to know, there are side effects. I say, well, on fish oil, no side effects. Because if they're getting diarrhea from it, we just tell them to take less fish oil. Usually you want to take like 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day, or even 3,000 milligrams 3 times a day, particularly fish oil. Now, I'm sure somebody looking at the form, if they're open to alternative medicine, say, okay, he's on some medication. But most of them say, what? It's not Prozac. It's not Paxil. It's not Zoloft. What is this? He's not really trying to get over his problem. So you're dealing with a pretty strong medical model often. And so a patient almost feels pressured into going on this if he's disabled and doesn't want to lose the disability because he's disabled and can't function, feel I better take this thing. But some people say, no, I'm not going to damage myself that way. Now, they'll typically ask for like a prognosis. Fair, prognosis, good, excellent. And also they want to know typically is this temporary or permanent? Usually it's a temporary one. I mean, when it's going to go permanent, then it'll go SSI, and that's more long-term, 3 to 5 years. But generally in my practice, I deal primarily with temporary disabilities. They want to know if there's any medication and the dosage. Sometimes they want to know, they want me to write down if there's a side effect. They always want to know expected date of return without restrictions. So there's a spot here on this form. And then ask comments. Now, sometimes in the comments, particularly in this form, the person may have been disabled the week before they saw me. If I made that assessment, I'll say, well, disability commenced a week ago on such and such a date. So I might put a comment there. Then I sign it. And sometimes they always want the signature, the date. Sometimes they want to know my area of specialization, or they want to know my tax ID number, or they want to know even my license number. So that's one form. It looks like this. Now, here's a pretty common one. It's called Certification of Healthcare Provider, Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. It's a pretty common one. And one thing they'll ask, how serious is the health condition? Is it hospital care? That's really something else. If the person's been hospitalized, then it certainly lends to the credibility that something's really matter. They've been in the hospital with this, especially overnight. And generally, most of my patients are not hospitalized if they're depressed. They're not that suicidal. Sometimes you get suicidal ideation, they're so depressed, but they don't really have a plan of hurting themselves. But I tell you what, when a person will run to a hospital, into the emergency room, panic attacks. Panic attack can feel like a heart attack, feel like they're dying. So they'll go in, maybe even stay overnight for observation. So a panic disorder. Now keep in mind, some diagnoses are more severe than others. Major depression in this state had legislation passed called the Medical Parity Act, where it's on the same level as a physical disorder. So if I diagnose a person with major depression, you have two types. The first episode, or it's a recurrent episode. One is 296.23, one is 296.33. It's a recurrent one, or it's the first one. That's credibility. That's a severe diagnosis. Panic disorder, very severe. If it's an adjustment reaction, they're just having a reaction to something that's going on, to something in their lives, it's not as severe. So they want to know, how severe is it? And one category is it due to pregnancy, they want to know. But the typical one for us that I'll use and I'll check off, chronic conditions requiring treatment. And it lists what that means. 1, requires periodic visits for treatment by a healthcare provider. 2, continues over an extended period of time. 3, may cause episodic rather than continuing period of incapacity. Now, that happens sometimes with, say, even depression or even psychoses. Somebody's diagnosed with psychosis. In layman's terms, you say he's crazy. But guess what? Not always crazy. He might just come in an episode. Something stressful happens. I have some people, I know one patient I had would go into a terrible episode of a manic episode. She had a manic bipolar disorder. She'd go into manic episodes when she fell in love with somebody. So every 3 or 4 years, she'd go literally out of her mind. I mean, just go to a manic episode and become very sexually active, spending money, driving like a mad woman, doing very destructive things. The rest of the time, the sweetest, nicest, gentlest human being you could ever meet. Go into an episode, boom. So you could have somebody that's episodic, where the episodes flare up. So I've written sometimes a disability saying, well, they want to know how often is this going to flare up. I might say, well, maybe once a month. They may need off a few days. Based on the history, it seems like once a month or once every 3 months it flares up. Some guesswork, you don't know exactly. It's not a precise science, but you give it a guesswork. And then if they don't need the time off, they don't take it. But at least then they have permission to come out when they're in an episode. Because in an episode, they could damage somebody or damage themselves. Particularly if you're dealing with a driver or somebody with machinery and they're very depressed or nervous, they can interfere with their concentration. They could hurt somebody. Crane operator, handling tons of things. If a person gets distracted for a second, it could cause a catastrophe. So typically, though, I have the chronic conditioning, may cause episodic, and then 4, will the patient need to have treatment visits at least twice a year due to the condition? Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of times I'll see people on disability twice a week. Then, on this particular form, they want to know, will it be intermittent? Well, as I just talked about, it is. Then, in this particular form, they want to know, is it medically necessary? Well, yeah, it's major depression. The diagnosis warrants this being done. Often they'll also ask, what is the date of the next visit? They want to know they're coming in and when is the date of the next visit. Often I can give them a date, but particularly if somebody's paying cash and they can't afford it, so I try to see them as often as I can to help them, but not so often that I'm taking their money. They're disabled. Their money is really hard to come by when a person's on disability. So I try to see them often enough to help them and lend them DVDs and CDs that I've produced that are going to help them to be therapeutic. And often enough to help them, but not too often to take too much of their money. So I might set an appointment for a month later, or I might leave it open. Say, call me, soon as you can. So in this case, I'll write open. But typically, I can give a date saying they're going to come in such and such a time. Now, in this particular form, they want to know, is the employee out because of their own condition, which is almost always the case with my people that come see me. But also there's a spot they need to be absent to take care of a family member, in which case there's family leave. So this is another type of form. So you have a letter that I could write. You have this form, which is one type of one employer has, another employer has this one. And these are just 2 of the forms, just to give you an idea of what they want to know. Now, how long can a person stay out? Well, some people hold a job for 3 months. There are others, particularly the person unionized, where it can be, I've had people out for a couple of years and they held the job open. But in this particular job, after 1 year, they no longer had their health insurance. They'd have to pay COBRA to have it. But they actually kept their health benefits for a year and the job. After a year, they would lose the health benefit unless they went on COBRA and paid something to keep their health benefit. But then when they go back to work, they have their benefits again. So That's one situation. Others can only do it for 3 months. They'll hold the job open. Keep in mind, if it's a mom and pop operation, 2 employees, 3 employees, you're gone, business will fold. They can't hold it, maybe hold it a week. After that, the business will fold up, they have to replace you. So a lot of the laws that protect the employee has to do if there's 50 or more employees. Now, state disability, which people pay into, they're entitled to that. It used to be it would cost about $50 a month. It's a good policy. It's a case where the government's really helping to look after people by having this policy. You can stay on disability. The state will pay you up to a year. After a year, they will no longer pay you. Then you return to work. If the person becomes disabled again, after 6 months, it will start reapplying again. But hopefully they'll never have to come out again. So now the state, as I said, will examine the person at some point in time during that to see if do they really think the person is disabled? And just to show how some of these monitoring agencies work, I have my patient who's been examined by the state. I've determined they're disabled, and they want to take them off disability at the job because their monitoring agency is saying, you know what, we think this person can go back. So unless they go back, we're going to see to it that their health benefits are discontinued. I've had people threatened whose children were having cancer, had people who were scheduled for surgery, and they still threaten to take them off. So what I see, unfortunately, is somebody injured in the workplace and then further injured due to other injustices by the monitoring agencies who then want to take away their health benefits, or even having supervisors call and harass the person, or workers' comp claim where the person is being threatened to be fired or being called, or various injustices where they're holding up the money. I see a lot of procedures that will exacerbate the original condition. So the person was traumatized to a point where they couldn't work, and then further re-traumatized, seeking justice. Now, if a person can hang in there, we use the power of justice will prevail, keep to their therapy, and usually I'll have them do exercise physically. I try to get the body strong, the mind strong, the spirit strong, to help them deal with this. I actually try to help people learn to actually get strength from what I call a hardship opportunity. I will gain power from this hardship opportunity, because it is an opportunity to gain power. Hardship can make us stronger. A hardship opportunity. I gain power from this hardship opportunity, and I'm grateful. Not grateful for the hardship, but for the opportunity to gain power. The testing that I use, some of the tests I've devised, but there's some standard tests. The CES-D is well established. The PSWQ, the Penn State Warrior Questionnaire with 0.98 sensitivity. So I have a battery of tests that I give. I recently devised my own test to help me assess the disability, called the Nerenberg Assessment for Work Stress Injuries, NAWI. And I have people rate from 1 to 5. 1 is not at all, 3 is medium, 5 is very much. We'll get a chance to go through some of these. Do you feel treated unfairly at work? 1 is not at all, 5 is very much. I find that most people will put like a 4 or 5. Do you see injustices at your job? Most people who are applying for disability do see injustices on their job, not only just against them, but against others. Do you have problems sleeping because of work-related stress? Very common. People just lie there thinking about the violation, how violated they feel, and anger, and then worry. Am I going to be able to keep my job? What's going to happen to me? Do you feel harassed by your supervisor or management? Typically, when somebody feels disabled, typically they do feel harassed by supervisor or management. Occasionally they feel harassed by another employee. When you're at home, do you go to sleep thinking about being treated unfairly at work? Actually think about that. And usually it's not one episode. It's usually a recurrent situation. It's been going on. I've had people who've been harassed ongoing for 5 months, 6 months. And after a while, they say, I can't take it anymore. It's not just one time. Do you feel harassed because of your race, gender, age, religion, or ethnicity? Particularly with minority groups, the person wonders if somebody's not that same race. They may say, well, I don't know, but maybe, or yeah, definitely. The other people of the same race aren't being harassed, and I'm being picked on for the things they get away with. But even if it's not the case, the person say, well, maybe. The person's a minority, and the supervisor's not a minority. They might say, well, maybe. Can't help wondering. But sometimes they go, yes, I know it is that. Are you more irritable at home due to work-related stress? That's one thing. They do become short. The boss, the supervisor, management harass them. They come home and yell at their wives. You know, the old stereotype, the boss kicks them, they kick the dog and yell at the wife. Those are the old cartoons. But there was a lot of truth in it. And often, very associated with this, are others treated better than you at work? That's part of it. Yeah, they're treated better. They get a longer lunch period and nobody complains. Or I have one person say, if I'm a minute late, I get written up. But there's one employee there who actually falls asleep on the job. The supervisor sees her falling asleep and doesn't say anything. I had somebody actually tell me that. Now, I'll ask, do you feel underpaid? And very often a person doesn't feel underpaid. They just feel, so it's not related to that. It's often related to other factors. I'm going to stop. I'm going to give you a chance. I've given you a lot of information. There's a lot more we need to go over. But I've given you a lot of information. So I want to give you, we have 3 or 4 minutes left. So I want to give you, if you want to ask any questions or make any comments to this point, please feel free to do that. Dr. Rainwater.
Okay, I've noticed that, well, maybe you didn't do it, but on purpose, but I noticed a lot of businesses that have a management section. I noticed that management, when you have a problem with them, they always tell you to go to human resources.
Right.
I know she didn't speak about that too much, but, and then when they go to human resources, it seems like it's not a place to talk your real problems, because all it is a personnel section, what I think. And they don't really deal with any problems. They tell, then all that information I notice is spilled out among the whole company.
So the privacy is violated.
I see it all the time, or I hear it all the time.
Good point. Human resources. Now, let's take a look at an important factor. Now, if a company is fair, human resources will help them. If the union's really motivated and fair, they will help them. The management will help them. They go to the manager, the person superior. They will help if they're fair. But now we're going to talk about often that's not the case. And if you want justice, often you got to go outside the system where somebody's eating out of a different bowl, not paid by the same employer. I have people who, they're everyone they go to is being paid by the same agency, and they back each other up. I'm talking when it's unjust, which is not always the case. In an unjust system, they back each other. So to get somebody outside, you got to go to the labor relations, or go to your congressperson. A lot of times you need somebody outside the system who can come in and say, hey, there's something wrong here. But if you go to people within the system, human resources, or even the union, sometimes there's a sweetheart contract. They don't do anything. You've got some really good union people. Great. But times not at all. I've seen both. So at times it's necessary to go outside the system and find out who your congressperson is, and you'd be surprised. They actually they'll have an assistant contact you. I was shocked once when I came to this state. I applied to my license here, and they said, well, you submitted your application too late. And see, my livelihood depended on this. I had children. So I went to my congressperson. I said, I submitted it too late, but I want to take the exam. They called me, got the information. I was surprised. They actually called me. The assistant congressperson called me. And 2 weeks later, I was admitted to the exam. But for licensure, I was shocked. It actually worked. So there is, when I say justice will prevail, there is recourse. But often you can't necessarily I couldn't go to the board and say, hey, give me a break. They weren't doing it. I had to go outside the system. So, and it's not just that they're unfair, just that they're busy with so many things they can't really consider each case. So I'm not saying that I was treated unfairly by my board. I just say they have so many things. They say this is the deadline. We can't make exceptions for everybody. They have their their resources too. They only have so many employees, so much funding to look into everything. So there are always these contingencies as well. How much can they really look into something? We have time for one more question.
I was just going to say, I think it pretty much came back to how you said capitalism. It's kind of ruined the whole thing from the point where the employee is always, or the employer is always trying to cut a corner and save costs. And then the insurance companies are kind of under the same mold where they are trying to cut costs and make a profit. And it kind of just works the whole way around. So that's...
Well, that's the problem. So it needs to be capitalism, which is the greatest system on this earth in terms of motivating people. It needs to be conscience with social responsibility. Otherwise, it's very dangerous. But capitalism with social responsibility, capitalism with morality, powerful. Without that, there's a great deal of injustices being done to people. Flora.
All these banks that went down the drain. No.
There's a lot of that was capitalism without social responsibility. That all the social ills, many deals we're having financially, where they just wanted to get their own bonuses, take care of themselves, which is just capitalism without social responsibility, making a lot of loans that shouldn't have been made, and this is the result. So we're getting a pretty good look at capitalism without social responsibility. On that note, I need to bring it, our time is coming to an end. I want to again thank you for this opportunity to be in your presence, the opportunity to serve you in this way, those of you in the room, those watching on DVD, and those listening on CD. Thank you.